the No Peace Without Justice series, Beyond COVID-19. As you have seen in the leaflet, this episode, organized by No Peace Without Justice and the Euro-Syrian Democratic Forum, will address the situation in Syria. We will take up the impact of the global epidemic on human rights, and also will try to explore future prospects beyond the current global emergency situation. My name is Hussein Sabbagh. I'm the Secretary General of the Euro-Syrian Democratic Forum, and I'm also a former Syrian diplomat. Before we start, I would like just to remind the audience to use the hashtag Beyond COVID-19, and that this episode would be available through the No Peace Without Justice website and its accounts on YouTube, Instagram, Twitter, and Facebook. I would like to start by welcoming the panel, Hiba Alhaji, Human Rights Advocate and Executive Director of Equity and Empowerment. Hosam Hafez, academic, lawyer, specialized in international law, and a former Syrian diplomat. And we have Klemens Semtner. He is a senior Syria advisor at the German Federal Foreign Office. And finally, Raheb Alwany, ENT doctor at York Hospital in the UK. Unfortunately, Raheb was not able to be present. She was asked to be on duty at the York Hospital, but she sent us a recording for her intervention. In fact, when we first contacted Raheb, she was on duty at the COVID-19 ward. As other Syrian doctors, she's at the forefront facing this epidemic. So I will go now directly to Raheb recorded contribution.
In a country where healthcare system is considered one of the national assets that British people have always been proud of. This country has also happened to have one of the strongest economies in the world. Yet, and despite all that, with the pandemic outbreak here, we are facing an unprecedented challenge where hundreds of people are dying every day, despite practicing social distancing and personal hygiene measures. Hospitals have been also suffering a massive shortage in personal protective equipment for healthcare professionals generally. Let's just take a minute to think about a war-torn country like Syria, a country that has been living one of the most violent conflicts probably of the century. It has been warned repeatedly by international organizations, including the WHO, that the spread of coronavirus in Syria might lead to one of the most severe outbreaks in the world. In 2019 alone, over 85 healthcare facilities were attacked by Russian and Syrian regime airstrikes, mainly in the north and northwest of the country. The WHO reported that every 4 days, at least one healthcare facility was bombed. All that has obviously left the healthcare system paralyzed. Now, one of the essential medical equipment that is key in treating advanced COVID-19 cases is ventilators and obviously intensive care beds. In an area that accommodates over 1.5 million people in northwest Syria, there is only 30 adult ventilators, nearly all already in use. That is 30 ventilators for over 1.5 million people. In my home city, Madinat al-Raqqa, Raqqa city, there is no free ventilators for the public. It is needless to say that personal protective equipment is extremely scarce there. Doctors are sometimes being given 1 or 2 ordinary surgical masks to use for their entire on-call shifts. There are also other factors that make the outlook of this crisis even more devastating. And here we're talking about both Syrian land and refugee camps inside and outside the country, such as Turkey or even Greek islands. Most camps are already many times over capacity. Areas in northwest Syria are enormously overcrowded, and practicing social distancing there is a luxury that people will never be able to achieve under the current circumstances. That is out of question. In many refugee camps, and also in some areas in the northwest of Syria, where the largest displacement of civilians happened last year, finding clean water sources has always been a struggle. But nowadays, that is reaching an alarming level, which practically means that frequent hand washing and using alcohol gel, which was advised by the WHO, is not as easy as it would sound and may not be an available option for many. Another very important aspect that I'd like to shed some light on this crisis is that there is a surge in domestic violence cases, which was also reported to have spiked over the past few weeks. There has been a massive increase in the numbers of phone calls to domestic abuse helplines. That is globally, and this wave is not going to exclude Syrian women who already suffer from very difficult circumstances. We are now in Ramadan month, according to the Arabic calendar, which is the fasting month for many Muslims, and people would normally practice their prayers collectively in mosques or also have iftar gatherings with relatives and neighbors at home. This might exacerbate the problem and bring about catastrophic consequences if people are not given the right advice. Now, there are humanitarian and legal responsibilities lie on the UN, the EU, and all people in power to rescue this country from an inevitable catastrophe. We have a very short window of time to intervene and prevent a disaster from happening. As we all know by now, this is a new disease, and guidelines and new advice is being issued almost every day. Keeping the people well informed and send daily updates is essential to raise their awareness about the severity and the scale of the problem, and also about the right behavior that should be maintained in response to this pandemic. I'd also urge all humanitarian organizations to at least supply hygiene essentials for refugee camps and also for deprived areas in the country. And last but not least, I can't stress enough that we always have to look at the root cause of the problem and remember that it's the Syrian regime who started this war against civilians. Thank you.
I would continue with you, Hiba, on the situation on the ground. People in Syria have been subject to different kind of um, acute sufferings for more than 9 years now. They were under real sieges, not really like the quarantine that we see today, and combined by barrel bombs, chemical weapons, starvation, detention, and torture. How would you describe the situation now with the new challenges posed by the COVID-19?
Well, good evening, Hussein and other respected panelists. And let me use this platform to say thanks so much for Raheb and all the doctors and nurses over the world who are responding to COVID-19. Actually, let me just start with the positive information that I'll be talking about one area inside Syria which hasn't reported any case of COVID-19 till now. It's Idlib. So whenever we talk about Syria, we're gonna be talking about different geographical contexts. I mean, like Northwest, Northeast, and the regime-controlled areas, and of course, like Syrian IDPs inside Syria and the refugees outside Syria. Now, for Idlib, till now, as the Directorate of Health in Idlib hasn't reported any case of COVID-19, but this doesn't mean that we are safe, because we know that the infrastructure in Idlib has been completely destroyed because of the airstrikes by the Russian and Syrian regimes during the last quarter of 2019. So people like the humanitarian cadres are really afraid that in case we have only one case, they were not going to have the adequate kits in order to respond to that. And at the same time, something positive is the appeal by the special envoy to Syria, Mr. Geir Pedersen, on the 23rd of March, who called for the ceasefire, and that has had positive consequences on civilians of Idlib, because now during the last few months, many civilians moved from the southern part of Idlib to the Turkish borders, and now because of the ceasefire, most of them are returning back. I mean, we're talking about, for example, Ariha and some small villages, and of course to the areas which are not controlled by the Syrian regime, because people in Idlib don't trust the Syrian regime after many crimes committed by the regime in the recontrolled areas in Ma'arat al-Nu'man and Khan Sheikhoun. Now, this is important. We can build on it. We can count on it, because it means as if like COVID-19 is just directing us that the solution in Syria is not going to be military. It's going to be political. And I think that it just moves us towards the 2254 resolution in order to end the suffering of the people in Syria. Now, when we move to the northeast, actually the situation is really bad, because we're talking about 2 million people who are stuck there, and everything is related to the central government in Damascus. So no examination centers, no medications offered to people there, and at the same time, a day before yesterday, the head of Qamishli Hospital reported the first case in Hasaka and Qamishli. Now, whenever we move to the regime-controlled areas, at the same time, on the 25th of April, the Syrian government reported 43 cases of COVID-19. Of course, like to me, I don't trust the statistics of the Syrian government. However, it means that the situation is really getting bad there. Although like it's our responsibility to deliver the COVID-19 kits to the people, to the civilians, but I'm afraid that the Syrian regime is going to use COVID-19 in order to lift the sanctions. And now we're hearing many voices from the regime affiliated persons to lift the sanctions. So it's here really important to shed the light that the sanctions don't include the medicine and food. So what is really also important is to talk about the reconciliation areas. We're talking about Daraa and Ghouta, so as if the regime is using collective punishment. So especially after the closure of the borders with Jordan, so people in Daraa are not receiving the adequate services or the medications. And like not far from it, a Rukban camp. So like it seems like a Rukban camp is a big prison for people. No INGOs working there or no NGOs working there. According to the refugees in Turkey and Lebanon, like 70% of the refugees here are working on a daily basis. They're working on the agriculture, construction, the factories. Because of the lockdown, the economic situation of these refugees are getting really bad. And the same for the refugees in Lebanon, but like added to the problem that they're not welcomed in the Lebanese hospitals, and that UNHCR stopped the financial cards for most of the refugees. This is in general the situation inside Syria. Like there are 2 points in common among all these areas. First of all, the increase of the domestic violence. So although there are not hotlines or protection centers for women, but like in all these areas, the domestic violence has increased. And second, the schooling and the teaching is happening online. So like because of the bad economic situations, the fathers and mothers don't have money in order to buy the mobile phones and internet in order to like for their children to receive the schooling. So I mean, consequently, the schooling is suspended like for many children inside Syria. I mean, this is just a brief about like the implications of COVID 19, not only on the medical level, like my colleague Raheb was talking about, like on the social and economic levels, if we can call it.
Thank you, Hiba. This is a wonderful brief. You've touched upon the situation in all areas. I will come back to you with a follow-up question, but for now I would turn to Hosam and um, to talk about maybe the political dynamics surrounding the situation. The so-called political process has been on hold now for quite time. Um, do you see any political developments underway? Are there any hopes with the current path or elsewhere? Um, I think you're on mute.
Sorry. No. Thank you very much, Hussein. Thank you very much for the panelists. I would like to start by summarizing some of the key points of the current situation in Syria inside the areas under the regime governance. We have weakness and corruption in the official Syrian administration for a series of economic problems and social problems as well. We have direct Iranian and Russian interference in the daily management of the country, the economic isolation, and direct and indirect sanctions on the economic system of the regime has taken its tolls on the ability of the regime to govern the country. Still, grim as it is, the scene has other dimensions. I think the conditions now has reached a stage where we can rely on reaching a direct solution, direct peaceful solution, lasting and ending, just ending for the Syrian crisis. The circumstances are much better than before because we have ceasefire or freeze of hostilities and military activities, even in the hotspots like Idlib. Therefore, the regime can't use the military operations and daily bombardment to direct and to dictate its maddest desires to blackmail the negotiations and the international community. The general international conditions, especially the political ones, are, I guess, ripe enough now to reach a level of diplomatic momentum to revive the negotiations between the regime on one side and the opposition on the other side, because I believe that the regime now has reached its final stages, and we have to act quickly, because if we leave the current deteriorations taking place, Syria is going to be a failed state in no time. The current coronavirus pandemic just added more nails to the coffin of the Syrian regime, and have shown that the regime can't be trusted even on the lives of its own loyal audience and loyal supporters. We have many signs now, game changes, I guess, in the political scene. We have very weak governance, failure in administration, severe shortage in resources, in cash flow in Syria, in cash flow in the market, caused by many reasons. One of them, of course, it's the closure of external link of the regime, which is Lebanon, where the regime is using usually to does its usual illegal financial and economic exchange. We have an increasing dependency by the regime on the dark market, the Syrian economy, and that is interconnected with the Iran and Hezbollah economies. The three of these economies are relying heavily on exporting the drugs, as now it's daily in the bulletin that the regime is exporting the drugs to all possible destinations. And also we have collapse in the purchasing abilities of the Syrian citizens. We have signs of division even inside the circle of the Bashar al-Assad family. We just witnessed, we just watched a YouTube video by Makhlouf, who is the head of the Assad mafia. He's complaining about the system, and is just trying to do excuses. And we also hear many complaints from within the military forces that are usually loyal to Assad. Last but not least, the harsh criticism against the Bashar Assad regime from the Russian press, close to the official Russian establishment, accusing Assad and his family of being very corrupt and weak. So all this come together. I guess we have to witness, and it's for everybody's interest to go back to the political track and to try to think outside the box. We have three, as everybody knows, we have three political tracks. We have the Astana track, we have Geneva Central political track, and we have the outcomes of the Sochi process, which is the SCC, the Syrian Constitutional Committee. Astana track has reached most of its goals, either by ceasefire or freeze of fighting or local truces and local reconciliations. The Geneva Central political process has been ended or freezed to give its place to the Sochi outcomes. The Sochi process produced the Syrian Constitutional Committee. However, the Syrian Constitutional Committee has proven, as expected, unable to reach any meaningful process in order to produce a constitution that is part of the Security Council Resolution 2254. So now we have a freezed or corrupt or impaired constitutional committee did not last for more than two rounds, two sessions, did not produce anything. Recently, we have witnessed, we heard Mr. Geir Pedersen, the Special Envoy for Syria, stated in his last brief that the two co-chairs of the SCC representing the Syrian regime and the negotiation committee on the side of the opposition has reached a sort of understanding for the next round of the work of SCC. However, the wording that Mr. Pedersen used is not promising at all. We came back to the very ambiguous wordings about some proposals for just to start a meeting between the two sides. The wording was revolving around phrases like the SCC jurisdiction, foundation for the Syrian Foundation, and Syrian national principles. So I guess we have to think about creating a new dynamics outside the SCC now, to call, for example, for an international conference very similar to the group, Friends of Syria group that convened in 2012 and produced the famous Geneva communique. We have plenty of positives now. Of course, the situation on the ground very grim. We have very disadvantages because the people of Syria are suffering. Therefore, and as the previous speakers said, we have to go back to the root of the problem. The people are suffering because of the existence of the regime headed by Bashar al-Assad in Damascus now. And now it's the time for everybody to give some efforts, really diplomatic efforts, to go beyond the existing mechanisms and the existing political talks in terms of the SCC, and to go back to Geneva to try to revive the real political process with enough support and backing of all the countries and all the international community. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Hosam. I will turn now to Klemens, and building on what Hosam said, and also not forgetting the current situation, the current global emergency situation. Many Syrians are saying that the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic, has turned the eyes, rightly so, from the conflict of Syria. International and regional players, they now they're busy with their own also domestic issues. Others also are saying that the world after COVID-19 is not the same as before COVID-19. They would argue that there would be no space to tolerate such protracted conflict, and it has to be solved. How do you see the future of the situation in Syria beyond COVID-19?
Well, Hussein, thank you very much for allowing me to speak, and thank you for the other speakers as well. Um, First of all, I don't think we're quite clear what devastating impact COVID-19 will have on Syria. I think the colleagues had described some of the aspects that it will be quite stark impact because of the dysfunctional health system and weakened populations, especially in the prisons and the IDP camps. I think we see that a lot of actors do focus on Syria. We have seen that Russia, China, Iran, and the regime itself have called for an end of sanctions. Now, I think we have to be more vocal in countering this narrative because it's simply not true that sanctions hinder the import of devices and medical into Syria. We've looked specifically as a German government on 21 very needed items, and we found that only one of those, there was some kind of restrictions which referred to ethanol in a concentration over 90%. And even that can be cleared in a few days if anybody seeks to import it. Otherwise, there are no limitations on those core issues. And I think we have to counter that narrative. It is absurd. The Western countries are the supporters and like-minded states give hundreds of millions of dollars in support. And we see that Russia is importing and bringing weapons into Syria, but not any medical supplies to help people. China had sent 3 little baskets, which we've seen on the internet. That's ridiculous. And I think we have to be more vocal in saying who is really helping the Syrian people, and that we're not being the situation caring about its own people. It has a main concern to keep its power. And I think there I would maybe differ with what Hosam had said. I'm afraid that we might see in this situation that really the Syrian state may fail, and the Syrian middle class, of whatever is left of that middle class, will suffer more. But definitely the regime will try to do anything to keep its power, and that may be shored up more. They may become even more aggressive. They may hold on more to their corrupt structures and use their warlords and cronies to protect their power, even if the rest of the country falls into shambles. Now, that has maybe one effect which might be unwillingly positive. What we've seen, that is because the Syrian government is not helping to the extent they should, we've seen that there's some local initiatives that have sprung up to help people and organize aid and strengthen, in a way, civil society apart from the central government. What do we see on the really must counter any kind of narrative that some other governments may say now that they want to normalize relations with the regime quicker because they need to have a cooperating partner in fighting the crisis of COVID-19. That is something which is not acceptable, which will not do. The German government will stick to its red lines and its humanitarian standards. And that means that the support in fighting not only COVID-19, but the broader humanitarian crisis must focus on those who need the aid most and not those who maybe have the best relations to the regime. That implies also that we will continue the fight to continue the cross-border resolution. You know that Russia and others had tried to stop a continuation of that very important resolution, which allows aid to cross into Syria from Turkey and Iraq. As the fact that the Zarabia border crossing has been closed, very important medical supplies had come in there to the northeast, and Germany will do everything that we get a continuation of that resolution. I'm not the spokesperson of the United Nations, but I must say sometimes the narrative that nothing is done must be corrected. In the last months, we've seen that more humanitarian aid has been trucked into the northwest than ever before. More than 1,400 truckloads crossed the border from Turkey into Idlib in the last month, despite the difficult situation of COVID-19. The German government has also not forgotten about Syria because of COVID-19. We have given another 150 million euro in emergency support at the beginning of the year to fight the humanitarian crisis. Altogether, for the first few months of this year, already 260 million euros have been given. There are another 360 million in the pipeline, and Germany will give this year as much as they've given in 2019, and we're up to 640 million euros in support. Now, I agree with what Hiba said, that there's a chance the ceasefire seems to hold better than maybe we had hoped in the beginning. More than 130,000 IDPs have returned to the original place where they lived, and we support the call of the UN Secretary General for a nationwide permanent ceasefire. That should be our aim. We were all very distraught when we saw the attack in Afrin the other day, when the bombing took place with more than 40 people dying. And that is a stark reminder that we might see this kind of violence continue in Syria, in parts of Syria, not only in the northwest, but also in the south and in the northeast. This is why Germany will continue to support the international coalition fighting ISIS. We've seen that ISIS, in the shadows of the recent development, has tried to regroup, and we must continue our fight that they don't come up. At the same time, we continue supporting the political process, not only politically, but also financially, to help the opposition, deadlocked by the regime. And that will only end if Russia changes its stance and pushes the regime to be more cooperative and constructive in these deals. We must convince Russia that their support, their efforts in the Astana format have come to a deadlock and is not leading anywhere, and that they can bomb Syria into rubbles if they want to or not, but no prosperous and peaceful future for Syria can be built under the Assad regime. And this is something we have to have, given some hope that this is being understood. Germany will not change its stance towards the Assad regime due to COVID-19, not at all. I mean, even more now, there's no framework for a comprehensive and voluntary return of refugees into Syria. And as long as the UNHCR doesn't give a green light for that, we will not allow that. Germany will not end its sanctions, it will not start reconstruction, it will not give legitimacy to the regime unless there's a meaningful and irreversible political process. And we will do our best to keep also the European Union member states together on that line. The election that is coming up, the parliamentary election, which therefore it is nothing we can build on. As long as the constitution is not changed, we will not see that the opposition can participate in any of these elections. That makes it more important than ever that we stick to our the issue of accountability, and that the regime is held responsible for what it's doing, and that we don't forget the recent OPCW report on 3 chemical attacks was a very, very good sign. The German government will continue pursuing that issue in the executive committee of the OPCW, and we will look whether this can be applied to further sanctions against individuals or entities. And we've transferred these data also to our federal criminal prosecutor, who will seek whether this can lead to more crime persecution of individuals. Let me just remind you, just in recent days, we had the trial against 2 regime representatives opening in Germany who worked in the prison system of the Assad regime. And I think we must make clear, even if some other high-ranking people hiding in Syria, they will never be able to leave the country freely under the accusations that are out there, and they will never be forgotten what they've done. And I think that's very important. We get clear signs that the people inside Damascus take note of these trials and are fully aware of what is happening, and that's their intention. But I think in this framework, it is very important that we let the Syrian people also know that these very important issues that people care about, that is the issue of the missing people and the release of detainees, must stay very high on that agenda, and is very closely linked to the issue of accountability. I can only see that from our point of view, despite COVID-19 and after COVID-19, we think Syria can still be saved in the long run, and we are not willing to give up on that effort. and we hope neither will you. Thank you.
Thank you, Klemens. I will just a quick question, if I may. I mean, because you spoke about how Germany stands, and I would just ask: is there a new EU strategy dealing with the current situation and with the developments, and maybe with also I would say non-developments, as we see this political process, as it's called, not making any progress?
Honestly, I must tell you, I don't see that from this crisis we will have really a great positive dynamics, but the negative dynamics may lead to a reassessment, as I said, of some of the other actors, like Russia, for instance, and that could lead to a new dynamics. And that is why we try to engage on that side to push forward all sides for the insight that there's no future under this development. But I don't really see that the regime is open to that acknowledgement. So at the moment, we're not building a new strategy, but we're preparing ourselves once there is a post-COVID-19 dynamics that we can and push all actors in the right direction, which means a permanent ceasefire, which means a real political process. But I must say my hopes are very limited at this moment.
Thank you. I will come back to you, Hiba. You have laid out many challenges. I would ask you now, and I know, just to please confirm that you have also you have team inside Syria, if I'm not mistaken. So what are your recommendations? What are your messages? Thank you.
Thanks so much, Hussein. Actually, I will repeat what Klemens was saying about the detainees, because they are our priority. And like, to me, I think that like there has to be a release of detainees without preconditions. And like now for our teams, because like I am from Idlib and my team is inside Idlib, so like now the talk is about the cross-border resolution. And like we're hearing from here and there, and the resolution is not going to be extended. So the non-extension of the cross-border resolution means literally that 4 million people in Idlib are going to be besieged, because the Damascus, the government of Damascus, isn't neutral and isn't fair in dealing with people, with the Syrians. And at the same time, according to the refugees in Lebanon, to me, I call on UNHCR to distribute the financial cards to the refugees, because it deleted the list of them. 70% of the refugees in Lebanon camps, names were deleted from UNHCR financial aid. And at the same time, to provide financial coverage for them in order to be in the hospitals. And actually, all the time we're talking about like the negative consequences of COVID-19. But like, to me, being a feminist and a woman rights activist, I felt that the percentage of participation of men in the housework with women has increased during the curfew and the COVID-19. So I think this has to be taken into consideration whenever we do programming for our projects, because in order to decrease the violence, we need to have that participation. And on the same context, I think that we need to think again in our programs in terms of themes, in terms of the time. All of us, we know that the INGOs need like long time for the proposals to be studied and like your budget to be applied. So like, to me, as a member of the civil society in Syria, like we wish that the procedures are going to be more flexible. And at the same time, I think that the equipment has to be delivered to the regime controlled areas, again without lifting the sanctions on the regime.
Thank you. This is a very valid point. So now when we're as we are in the last round, so I would like to ask you, Sam, if you have any response to what have been said by Klemens, and maybe possibly if you have proposals. Um,
Thank you, Hussein, and thank you, Klemens and Hiba. In fact, I would like to mention that we thank and we highly appreciate the help that Germany and other countries in the EU for their stance with the Syrian people and their stance against the Syrian regime. However, as far as the political peace process is concerned, we've been hearing that level of support for a long time now, for 8 years since 2012. But throughout the peace process, we haven't found any results. The peace process is short of bearing any result. So insisting on having the same process, changing of course of tracks, but the same process without new dynamics, I guess that would not leave us or lead us anywhere. So what I proposed, what I'm trying to think out of the box and to not to stick only to the Constitutional Committee, which I see it as a departure from the direct and indirect application of 2118 and 2254 Security Council resolutions related to the Syrian crisis. I see that I believe that we have to go back to the central negotiation between two parties, the regime and the opposition, under the direct auspices of the United Nations and with the involvement of the stakeholders and key players, including the Russians. The Russians, as Klemens said, has the upper hand in Syria now, and it has some common interest with the West in Syria, which is to isolate and to keep the Iranians out to take the Iranians out of Syria. We have some common grounds between the two parties, so we have to build on that. I don't see enough engagement, enough involvement in terms of diplomacy. We don't have enough momentum, diplomatic momentum, to revive the real process and to try to bring the Russians in the process in order to finalize a final solution. We have, as I said before, we have some very important indications and signs coming from the Russian press and from inside the regime as well. We have some new, it's not a complete game changer, but still we have some new data, new determinants in the scene. We have that should relate to more effective and dynamic political and diplomatic movements by our supporters, by our friends, in order to create the new track, or to go back rather to the main track of the political negotiations, not a committee, negotiations in Geneva, which is a direct application of 2118 and 2254. This is just a basic idea, but if we have time, we can go through it, or we can prepare another, organize another session to go deeply in that direction. Thank you, Hussein.
Well, it definitely needs a separate session. Unfortunately, we don't have much time now, but you now have encouraged me to get this into a discussion maybe in the near future. But I will go now to Klemens for your final words, concluding remarks. We're not pushing for a positive note, but please, if you have any specifics, go ahead.
Well, I want to reiterate what I said, that please don't have the impression that Germany will let you fall down because of the COVID-19 crisis in Europe and around the world. That's not the case. If you allow me one sentence to what Hosam had said, in terms of new dynamics, Russia in the Astana process had kind of reshuffled the order of the 2254 agenda by bringing up the Constitutional Committee at a time when other things should have happened. And I think the UN Special Representative reached out to grab that opportunity in order to lead the talks back from Astana to Geneva. That was the intention which we followed with this process. And still we've seen that the regime was not willing to acknowledge that they talked directly with there. But it was the only bridge we could see leading us back to any meaningful dialogue in Geneva. So by saying this has failed now too, and coming back to the other process that was before, the direct talks, which had not led to anything, I would urge that we not give up yet on this constitutional process. And when I speak to Hadi al-Bahr, the co-chair, and others of the opposition, they are not willing yet to give up on this process. It needs a lot of patience, but I would not walk away from that table yet. But I'm grateful that we will be able to continue that discussion because there are a lot of other issues associated with that. Thank you very much.
Thank you. We have come to the end of our discussion. I would like to thank warmly thank the panel for their insights and contribution. I would like also to thank the No Peace Without Justice team. Thanks also to Francesca, Camelia, and Stefano. And thanks for all those who tuned in. The next episode of Beyond COVID-19 will be on the same time next week. Thank you and goodbye.
Thank you.
Thank you very much.